Buen día. La Universidad Nacional, la Vicerrectoría de Investigación, el Instituto Regional de Estudios en Sustancias Tóxicas, como parte de sus conferencias anuales, y en esta ocasión se suman la maestría en bioética y la maestría en salud ocupacional. Tienen el honor de contar esta mañana con la participación del doctor Leslie London, que estará ofreciendo su conferencia denominada Los conflictos de interés en en investigación en salud ocupacional y salud ambiental. Este es un tema trascendental en el contexto actual para la universidad, y el profesor tiene una magnífica experiencia y aportes al respecto. De ahí que invito en estos momentos al doctor Jorge Herrera, vicerrector de investigación de la universidad, quien nos dará unas breves palabras de inicio. Adelante.
Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Sean bienvenidos de parte de la Universidad Nacional, la Vicerrectoría de Investigación, el IRET y la Maestría en Bioética a esta conferencia del día de hoy. Un saludo muy especial a todos los organizadores y al personal académico, al estudiantado y por supuesto al doctor Leslie London, que nos acompaña como conferencista el día de hoy. Pensando en el mensaje que quería transmitirles el día de hoy, creo que hoy más que nunca resulta de fundamental importancia que como universidades públicas y centros de investigación nos planteemos una discusión muy profunda sobre el tipo y características que debe de tener los procesos de investigación que se desarrollan en nuestras instancias. Y es que estamos llamados, sobre todo los entes que trabajamos con fondos públicos, a asegurar que la investigación que se realiza en las universidades sea una investigación de calidad, que genere impacto e incidencia sobre la solución de los problemas que aquejan a nuestra sociedad. Pero para tratar de obtener una investigación que sea de calidad, que tenga impacto y tenga pertinencia, nosotros tenemos que ser capaces de generar investigación que hagan abordajes de objeto de estudio de forma crítica e innovadora en correspondencia con las áreas de conocimiento y la ciencia que se están planteando en los proyectos. Necesitamos, para poder hacer buena investigación, contar con un conocimiento lo suficientemente sólido de la disciplina, de los métodos y de las técnicas con las que usualmente abordamos científicamente el objeto de estudio. Necesitamos que sea una producción científica y académica que favorezca la ciencia abierta, pero además requerimos que esa investigación que se realiza se haga en apego irrestricto a los más altos principios éticos que se encuentran contemplados tanto en la normativa nacional e internacional cuando corresponda. Ocupamos también que esa investigación nos lleve de la especialización disciplinaria a la evolución de abordajes multi, inter y transdisciplinarios que requieran un nivel de complejidad de acuerdo con el problema de investigación que se ha planteado. Indiscutiblemente necesitamos una investigación que plantee una amplia vinculación con la comunidad científica nacional e internacional, que promueva la sistematización, la evaluación y la movilización de resultados. Y si nosotros consideramos el área de salud ambiental y el área de higiene ocupacional, todavía estas características revisten de una mayor importancia, porque generalmente en este tipo de investigaciones nos abocamos a poder analizar cómo agentes químicos, físicos y biológicos están afectando la salud de las personas a las cuales se encuentran expuestas. El abordar objetos de estudio tan complejos implica precisamente garantizar procesos adecuados, utilización de técnicas en estricto apego a los más altos principios disciplinares, pero también implica mantener procesos de rendición de cuentas, de información a la comunidad y un manejo adecuado de la información. Celebro el que el Instituto Regional de Estudios en Sustancias Tóxicas y la Maestría en Bioética hayan planteado este tema como un tema a abordar con el conferencista del día de hoy, dada la trayectoria que tiene tanto el IRED como la Universidad Nacional en investigaciones de este tipo, y espero que los temas que se vayan a abordar el día de hoy sean de provecho para todos los conferencistas. Agradezco muy especialmente al doctor Leslie London por su disponibilidad para podernos acompañar esta mañana y les deseo a todos y todas muy buenos días.
Thank you so much.
So let me chance to introduce you.
Okay.
Profesor London. Una cuestión práctica, logística, para quienes nos escuchan en estos momentos en la sala o vía Facebook. Esta conferencia se está transmitiendo a través de la página de la Vicerrectoría de Extensión y en breve será transmitida, será reproducida su grabación a través del sitio web de tanto del Instituto Regional en Estudios en Sustancias Tóxicas como de la Vicerrectoría de Investigación. Me permito presentar al profesor Leslie London, quien es especialista en salud pública con énfasis en derechos humanos. Leslie London ha realizado importantes contribuciones en la ética de la salud pública, en temas vinculados con la salud de los trabajadores agrícolas, también en prevención de daños relacionados con el alcohol y otros peligros para la salud a causa de la exposición a agroquímicos. Él es director de la División de Medicina de Salud Pública, desde donde dirige el programa Salud y Derechos Humanos. Esto es en el Centro de Investigación en Salud Ocupacional y Ambiental de la Universidad de Ciudad del Cabo. Leslie es un investigador académico con importantes aportes técnicos en la salud pública, dirigidos especialmente a población que sufre de tuberculosis extremadamente resistente, así como población con VIH-Sida. Esto principalmente lo aporta desde la Dirección de Evaluación del Impacto Sanitario de la Consejería de Sanidad en Sudáfrica. Cuenta con una vastas publicaciones y uno de sus temas más recientes es el que nos va a compartir esta mañana. Welcome, Dr. London, to the National University of Costa Rica. For more than 20 years, we have shared communication and efforts in the matter of health of vulnerable workers. Shortly before the COVID-19 pandemic, the bioethics and the occupational health master programs invited you to visit us to discuss the bioethical challenges at the occupational and environmental health research, but conditions did not make it physical possible. Connectivity today gives us the conditions to have your participation. Faced with persistent health problems and other emerging ones related to exposure to toxic substance, technological change, and other problems that increase the vulnerability of workers in marginal conditions, made us reflect on the role of research and the use of the evidence that results from the investigations. Thank you very much for being here. Now I give you a pass to share your most recent work.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días. Aquí, buenas tardes. I used to speak some Spanish when I was on sabbatical at the university in 2003, pero mi español es muy mal aquí. So I will speak in English. I'm going to talk about work around conflict of interest, because I think conflict of interest is very important for research, for policy, for public health policy, for policy around occupational and environmental health protection. And it's important certainly for young researchers, students, to understand that this is a big challenge we need to address. So what is a conflict of interest? There are many definitions, and I'm going to use this one, which I think is easy to understand. It's a set of conditions in which your professional judgment concerning a primary interest, such as a patient's welfare or the validity of your research, tends to be unduly influenced by a secondary interest, some other interest, such as financial gain. I think that summarizes it quite nicely. So when you have your own interest and you have the interest of a patient or the research, those two are in conflict and you have to manage it. So I must do the first thing in all presentations. I must declare my conflict of interest, and I declare I have no financial conflict of interest, but I am a human rights activist. So I must declare that I'm an advisor to these various organizations. I'm going to talk about them. So you need to understand when I talk about them, I've been involved with the South African Alcohol Policy Alliance, with the editorial board of the International Journal of Environmental and Occupational Health. And in fact, I lodged the complaint against the publisher, which I'm going to talk about shortly. So, why does conflict of interest matter? Well, we know that public policy can be shaped by health research. President of the United States got it in his head that chloroquine was good for COVID. And suddenly this meme went around the world and everybody thought they need to get chloroquine, until we discovered, in fact, that the research suggesting it was effective, the research was faulty. And there might have been a conflict of interest in that matter. So conflict of interest is important because public health policy is shaped by health research, and if there's conflict of interest in that research, we have a problem. So in the clinical setting, it's well known. We know that pharmaceutical companies market to doctors, market to physicians. They influence how the physicians practice. Clinician researchers who have financial interests are often associated with findings about certain drugs or investigations that are shown to be effective, but there's a financial interest behind that. And we know that big pharma lobbies any regulation if they can. Pharmaceutical industry sponsors professional meetings, CPD conferences, and the organizations I'm involved with all fight against that. But that problem really focuses usually on the individual health provider. So we have professional regulatory bodies. So I must register with my professional council, and it will have regulations or guidelines to guide me as a doctor who's registered with a council. The ethics committee to whom you apply for ethics permission should look at conflict of interest, but they focus on you. So that is an individual problem, but in public health, we have a different kind of conflict of interest problem, because public health policy can be swayed by research. So here's an example from Lithuania, because I do work on alcohol policy. What happened in Lithuania was during the Soviet occupation, there was a very controlled society, and alcohol addiction, problem drinking, was a big problem. But with the liberalization of the economy, suddenly alcohol became much more freely available. And Lithuania is one of the top 3 alcohol consuming countries with alcohol-related harm in the world. It's a small country, like Costa Rica. They introduced various kinds of control measures. And what happened over a period of about 5 years was they introduced a ban on the advertising of alcohol. And the ban was basically turned around because industry funded research, sort of public opinion polls, which gave the impression that the people were opposed to this ban. And eventually the ban was rescinded. But the people lobbying for the research had links to the alcohol industry. So this was a very clear example of how public policy can be swayed by research where there is conflict of interest. So we're all living with COVID at the moment. And this is not so much about research, but I just want to share with you some examples from my context. if you can see in the top right-hand corner, there are some commuters. They're actually waiting to board a bus, and they're walking through a booth, and the booth is a disinfection booth. It basically sprays them with a disinfectant, and this was introduced supposedly as a measure to control COVID. And worse still, you see on the left-hand side, there's a worker in a factory who's walking through one of these booths in order to get to work. And we know that it's not an effective measure for addressing COVID, because even if it does kill the virus, you still have would be infected inside and cough up the virus later once you're through the booth. So it doesn't stop you infecting anybody, and having the virus on your clothes or skin is not the main route of infection. It's when you cough it up. But it was the case that in South Africa, the people who manufacture these booths were marketing these booths to every employer who would listen to them. And a lot of employers bought this booth. So in the absence of evidence, this booth was then popularized on the basis of people panicking about COVID. The other example is deep cleaning. And this was a very interesting case. So when companies were affected by COVID, they had a COVID case. Initially, they panicked. So they would close the factory or close the shop, call the health officials and clean. They would have to clean that place. Now, we know that you can get rid of COVID through very basic disinfectant measures. You don't need anything fancy. But here's an example of a certificate that was given to a big supermarket chain. The company is called Rent-O-Kill, and they've given them a high-level treatment certificate saying within 72 hours of the case of coronavirus being reported, we have cleaned this and sterilized it. And they used a chemical called ViroKill. And ViroKill turns out to be a quaternary ammonium compound, which is actually a compound which is actually far more than what you need to address COVID, because I don't know if you can see this, but it's actually intended for killing bacterial spores, Clostridium, very hard bacterium to kill. And this compound kills it. But the coronavirus is actually relatively easily denatured by soap. You wash your hands for 20 seconds, 30 seconds with soap and water, you've gotten rid of that virus. You don't need a alkyl quaternary ammonium compound. The companies were having a field day selling them on the basis. Then a very interesting development, the Gauteng Health Department. So that is a province in South Africa, the biggest where Johannesburg is. The Gauteng Health Department wanted to investigate non-touch disinfection methods during COVID. And they proposed to purchase these methods. There were two methods. One was a pulsed ultraviolet irradiation system, and the other was an aerosolized hydrogen peroxide system. And in the documentation, it was said that these methods have the potential to rapidly disinfect environmental surfaces and the respirators, and they're a promising technology for the reduction of environmental and PPE bioburden, and will enhance the protection of healthcare workers and patient safety. So I was asked to give some advice to the health department. So what was the evidence actually presented to support this technology? Well, here's a paper on the role of no-touch automated room disinfection systems in infection prevention and control. It's published in the Journal of Hospital Infection. It's an Elsevier journal. It's peer-reviewed, seemingly reputable. But if you look more closely, the first two authors actually worked for a company called Bioquell. And guess what? Bioquell is the producer of an aerosolized hydrogen peroxide system. The other system, pulsed ultraviolet irradiation, well, this paper that was presented was published in a preprint. And it had about 12 or 13 authors, and only 2 of them were linked to Xenex, which is the company that manufactures this. But if you look at the list of disclosures, in fact, half of the authors were actually paid by Xenex, even though they worked at the Department of Medicine in the College of Medicine, Texas University, for example. So half of the authors were actually paid. Of course, we know that preprints are a good thing in one hand because they help you to get information out quickly, but preprints are not peer reviewed. If you see this med RV or RXYIV, they always say that this is not peer reviewed, so it should not be used to influence policy. But we know for a case that they're often used to influence policy, and here's one example. The Gauteng Health Department is asked to consider this technology based on a published paper that has not been peer reviewed and has many conflicts of interest. And Xenon is the producer. And another example in South Africa was during the COVID first wave, the South African government banned the sale of tobacco products. And it was based on the evidence that suggested that smokers were at risk for very severe forms of disease, at risk for death, and certainly ICU admission. And also there was some concern that smokers would share cigarettes. Industry took government to court. In fact, there were 2 court cases, and I was involved in these cases as well. The evidence that was mustered by the industry was dominated, firstly, by preprints, again, papers that were never subject to peer review, and a lot of papers from researchers who did not declare their industry funding. So they were funded by either industry itself or by the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, because as we know, there was a lot of fuss made about the idea that nicotine might protect you from COVID, which is a biased result out of certain studies, but was not supported by the biological evidence. So conflict of interest does matter because if it's not explicit, it can be hidden, and then the research is used to support certain kinds of policy directions. Another example from where I work on a question of alcohol. South Africa has a very big alcohol problem. About 7% of our disability-adjusted life years lost in South Africa are due to alcohol consumption. We don't have a large number of drinkers, but of the drinkers in South Africa they drink very heavily. So 33% of men are risky drinkers, meaning they binge drink or drink greater than 7 units a day. South African government has tried to introduce various pieces of legislation, such as regulating advertising, banning advertising, restricting hours of sales, restricting where you can buy. And every time there's a legislative move, it's met with opposition by what are small traders, taverners or shebeen owners. In other words, these are people in informal settlements or living in poor areas who make their living selling alcohol. And the industry supports these lobbying efforts, but it also funds an organization called the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation. And their research is always brought up at these public policy engagements to claim that any legislation is going to destroy the livelihoods of people in these informal sectors. But these pieces of research never declare any industry funding. So this paper from the Journal of Modern African Studies from 2014 was a very strong critique of the regulations that were being brought out to try and bring people who sell alcohol to make them licensed, so they're brought into the system and better controlled. And this paper was a very strong argument against it, but did not declare any industry funding when they are actually funded by the South African breweries, the biggest alcohol industry in South Africa and actually in Africa. We can go on. The sugar sweetened beverage. South Africa introduced a tax, much like Mexico. Initially, it was proposed at 20%. There was very intense public debate, lots of negative comments in the paper. It's interfering with my rights. It's going to be bad for the poor. There was very heavy lobbying by the industry. And a certain institute produced a research report called a stealth tax, not a health tax. And that report was very severely opposed to the tax, produced all kinds of reasons it was going to be bad for the poor. and that institute engaged Treasury to try and drop the tax. It subsequently emerged that that study was funded by Coca-Cola. Eventually, the sugar tax was finally adopted, but not at 20%, but at 10%. But if it hadn't emerged that the study was funded by Coca-Cola, it might have been the case that the sugar tax would not have been adopted at all. So here's work closer to my field. So this is pages from a Department of Agriculture newsletter, which usually only has positive news, as government department newsletters will have. Here they say, GM, genetically modified maize in South Africa, planted on nearly 20 million hectares in 16 years. And the first GM crop was planted in 1998. So here's the Department of Agriculture saying how fantastic it is doing well by planting genetically modified crops. So here in 2015 is a picture from Agricultural News. It's the same newsletter. In the middle there, you can see the Minister of Science and Technology, Naledi Pandor, who, by all accounts, is a fine minister who takes science seriously. In the picture, she's accompanied by some other people. So this is an official from the Department of Science and Technology. And here is an official from something called Biosafety South Africa. Biosafety South Africa is a publicly funded national biosafety service platform, which was set up by the Department of Science and Technology. And its mandate is to develop innovative, safe, and sustainable products within the South African biotech sector to promote public-private partnerships and basically assist companies with GM applications under our law. So essentially, it's set up to make it easier to register GM crops or GM technologies. In front of him is a rep from Bayer, Monsanto, and the Center for Environmental Risk Assessment in the USA surrounding the minister. What is the Center for Environmental Risk Assessment? It's set up by the Institute of Life Sciences, ILSI, I forget what the second I is. ILSI, as we know, is a Washington-based lobby group that's funded by the food, chemical, and drug companies. And shortly after this, parliamentary committees, in other words, that's members of parliament who serve on committees, they are told that GMOs are one option for food security in Africa. Independent, and it says independent African scientists have shown the safety of this technology. These products are safe, relevant, accessible, acceptable, and profitable. So I'm not going to go into the question of GM safety. I'm just making the point that the science is presented as if it's value-free and independent. But South Africa is the third most biodiverse country in the world. And you in Costa Rica will know about biodiversity because Costa Rica is famous for its biodiversity. In 2015, the same minister notes that South Africa has this fantastic biodiversity. We will not permit GMOs to threaten this biodiversity, but she also notes we are an emerging economy and we want it to grow to benefit everyone. So at that stage, South Africa was the 8th largest adopter of GM crops in the world. Maize, corn, which is a staple in South Africa, 86%, I think it's now well over 90%. All our cotton is GM and almost all our soya is GM. 2.9 million hectares under GM in 2015. So the problem is, it's not that the industry influences government on its policy. The industry is actually right inside government. It's right inside the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Science and Technology. So the science cannot be independent because industry are basically making decisions. So here's another example. I do a lot of work on pesticides. This was a study, a survey of acute poisoning in South Africa based on information at a poison center at a big teaching hospital in Cape Town, published in our national journal. A very fine descriptive study. Nothing said that was untoward or outrageous. They basically described what they heard and didn't make any particular other comments. But there was an editorial to this review, this study, and the editorial was published by somebody called Gerard Verdoorn, who lists his affiliation as the director of the Griffin Poison Information Center, which is a sort of conservation group for birds, basically. He does not declare the fact that he's been a paid consultant for CropLife South Africa for many years. Does not declare it at all. So this editorial gets published, no declaration of conflict of interest. And if you look at what he says compared to what was actually in the article, the study from the hospital said pesticides, and they give the percentage, were the most common classes of non-drug chemical exposures, and cholinesterase inhibitors are the most commonly ingested non-drug chemicals. What does he have to say? He says, the study shows beyond any doubt that pesticides are not the main agent in human poisoning. So what is he reading? The same paper? Hard to tell. The paper makes no inference about the behavioral determinants of poisoning. It simply reports what it found. And it calls for restricting how pesticide products are sold and distributed, irrespective of how they're used. What the consultant here says is end users of pesticides are highly irresponsible in the way in which they store and use these products, which is not a finding which comes out of the paper. It's just his opinion. And he's well known for going around basically arguing there's never a problem with a pesticide. The problem is always with a person. And that is a very, very common industry refrain. But he hasn't declared his industry affiliation. We told the journal about this. We said they should publish an erratum or correction, but they failed to do so, which is a problem, which I will come back to. So this table is quite dense, but I just want to draw your attention. It's from Nick Freudenberg, who's done a lot of work around corporate hazards, harms of corporations. And that first set of paragraphs really points to how science and evidence can be co-opted or used to undermine policy. So the evidence to protect public health conflicts with private corporate goals to avoid regulation and maximize sales profits. So what does industry do? They sponsor studies to support industry claims. So Gerard Verdoorn will always get money from industry to produce a result that says that it's not the pesticide that's the problem, it's the person that's the problem. They will fail to disclose industry funding. We see that a lot. It used to be a problem in many of the committees, but we know IARC and WHO have now clamped down on that and been very strict about declaring industry funding, although it's not always possible to pick that up. Attacking the credibility of those independent researchers who speak out, and I'll give you an example of that later. Undermining the competence of public agencies. So we saw that a lot during the Trump era, when public agencies were basically intimidated from speaking the truth. Surreptitious monitoring of independent scientists, people report that. Refusing to disclose their data, and setting up front organizations to do all of the above. And of course, corporates also influence policy and create ideological conflicts, but I'm going to stick with the question of research for the moment. So, corporations are really mandated by law to look after the best interests of their investors, shareholders, and the company. So if a CEO of a corporate actually decides to do the right thing, and for instance, donate the intellectual property of their latest COVID vaccine discovery to the WHO CTAP pool, he could be fired or she could be fired for doing that because they're not looking after the best interests of the investors or the shareholders. So the nature of corporations are created by law. They have one purpose, and that purpose is almost always in conflict with public health. Unlike most people, corporations wield enormous power. It's not a joking matter to think that they're just another person. Like Mitt Romney, corporations are people, my friend. Their influence is unmistakable and it's not replicable by an NGO or by civil society lobby groups. They are very strong. And in fact, of the 100 largest economies in the world, 63 are corporations and 37 are countries. And the consequence of that is that they have a lot of sway over governments. And John Maynard Keynes made this statement, which I think is very sobering. He says, there's nothing a government hates more than to be well informed, for it makes the process of arriving at decisions much more complicated and difficult. So if a corporation can influence the government, it will. Here's a slide of the world's largest corporations with the GDPs, revenue per GDPs of various countries. And you can see the bars in gray, slightly darker, those are corporations, and the slightly lighter ones are countries. So this is somewhere in the middle. So I'll just read it off for you if you can't see it. Norway, Walmart, South Africa, Greece, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Romania. You get the idea. Corporations are like countries. They're as powerful as countries, but they are not subject to the same accountability. So one of the things corporates and industry people like to do is they like to equate financial conflict of interest with non-financial conflict of interest. And it is true, non-financial conflict of interest can bias scientific research. We've seen that. But the power of money is so overwhelmingly strong that when you equate financial conflict of interest and non-financial conflict of interest, it's usually mischief. It's usually trying to deflect the fact that somebody has a very, very substantial bias in how they're interpreting data or presenting themselves. Industries, NGOs, civil society groups have very few resources to lobby or elect officials who are favorable to their point of view. They can't sponsor scientific studies, and they can't influence the media because they don't have that wealth to do so. So if you are a person who has a position on a public policy where public interest is driving your position, that's not a crime. If you believe that alcohol advertising is harmful to health and imposes a burden on your country, and you've published about that, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not a conflict of interest. But having a position on a public policy where your own private interest influences your position, that should be prevented. So if you have a directorship in an alcohol company and you are in a position where you are making policy decisions or you are doing research into alcohol harms, that is a direct conflict of interest and it should not be permitted. Or if it is there, it should be managed or at least made transparent. The United Nations has this procedure, FENSA, which I forget exactly what it stands for, but it's basically about how to manage engagement with non-state actors. In other words, corporations and civil society. But the problem with FENSA is that it simply equates everybody who's not government. So it says NGOs, CSOs are the same as corporates and the Gates Foundation and all those things. And it says there's nobody who has a unique conflict of interest, and everybody should be treated as the same way. And that is a real problem. So how do conflict of interest practices affect epidemiology? So firstly, rather than doing an impartial analysis, scientists can produce and disseminate misinformation, engage in disinformation, suppress data. The association between a cause and effect can be obscured and denied. Scientific integrity can be undermined. Public trust in the science of epidemiology can be eroded. We've seen that a lot with COVID. Workers, the public, and the environment can be harmed. And the classical techniques that skew results, you can do an underpowered study and you'll be guaranteed to find no effect. And then you interpret that the fact that you found no effect as to be evidence that there's no effect, when actually all you found is an absence of any evidence. In other words, you don't know whether there is an effect or not. Inadequate follow-up methods. So if you're studying cancer, you follow up too short, and of course you find there's no impact of a hazard. Inadequate follow-up methods, sorry. So you don't follow up for the right outcomes. Your controls are contaminated, so you blur the measure of effect. You interpret in biased or selective ways. You ignore mechanistic information, so you only rely on epidemiological studies which can't show effects. You exaggerate differences between human and toxicology studies seen between animals and humans, and you ignore how molecular structures may predict hazard potential. So in the area of endocrine disruption, that's really important. And when it comes to influencing policy, it's quite common to see this happening. You insist that you first have to demonstrate effects in local populations of exposed people. It doesn't matter that every other population in the world has developed mesothelioma from chrysotile asbestos, but you say, no, in our country, we have to show that chrysotile exposure causes mesothelioma. which is a death sentence for people, and it's insisting on a standard of science which is not necessary, and that's unethical. You might also fail to make explicit the value judgments that go into deciding appropriate standards of evidence for drawing policy relevant conclusions. In other words, you're suppressing dominant interests and values in the way you interpret the data. And of course, you can also attack the scientists who bring the right message. So you can deny, you can delay, you can divide, and you can discredit. And that is often done. Comment with two quotes, which I think are very relevant. Corporations create 80% of gross national product. They, of all entities, have the most potential for good or evil in our society because they are so powerful and have so much resources. And Clayson and Halperin, commenting in the Journal of Public Health Policy, say industries are offensive against the regulation of health and safety hazards uses academics to downplay or deny the seriousness of the hazard. So who is implicated? So we as individual researchers have to be careful. The journal authors need to be of integrity. The reviewers have to be of integrity. The journal editors have to meet standards. Corporate sponsors of journals, in other words, the publishers, public health practitioners, policymakers. So everyone is involved in having to think about conflict of interest. So just to talk about journals for a bit. So journal publication implies rigorous peer review. We're talking about the peer-reviewed literature, not the other literature. And generally, it's considered critical to disseminating new scientific findings that are valid and that people will use for policy. So publication integrity is absolutely essential, and health policies have to be free of vested interests. But we know that there's increasing pressure on journals from third parties, and particularly corporate interests. There is a Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, which was established to provide guidance for editors, journals, and publishers. And most journals who want to believe that they are of high standing will be members of COPE. You will see if you go to the journal, they claim to be a member of COPE. It also provides a forum for members to discuss individual cases or challenges or learn best practice. And it also receives and deals with complaints. So one of the things COPE says, the duty of the editor is to maintain the integrity of the academic record and preclude business needs from compromising scientific and ethical standards. So I want to speak about a case involving the International Journal of Occupational and Environmental Health, which many of you will know. It had a long history of publishing peer-reviewed articles, many of which were critical of industry bias in research and were prepared to raise questions of risks in industries that were very powerful. Taylor and Francis is a publishing company. They took over the journal in 2015. The existing editor at the time had a contract which ended in December 2016. What the journal did was to appoint a corporate consultant as the new editor. It did not consult the editorial board. I was on the editorial board at the time. And next thing we heard, oh, here's a new editor. And the new editor is actually somebody who consults for industry. He's associated with this organization, Toxicology Excellence for Risk Assessment. You will know it probably has very little to do with excellence, has a lot to do with risk assessment, but usually in the direction of hiding risk. And in fact, Terra was the subject of a paper published in the journal, pointing out how it misrepresented the risk assessment related to acetal. Diacetyl is the cause of popcorn lung, and the editor Meyer was severely criticized for his analysis. So in February of the next year, the editorial board wrote to the publisher and asked for reasons why this happened. The publishers responded. They said, well, we consulted over the direction of the journal and the new editor, which is completely untrue. They did have a conversation with one of the editorial board members who swears it was not a consultation over the new editor, and he did not approve this new direction. The repositioning of the journal, which the publisher said, was about how we might position this journal to cover the multiple perspectives of this diverse area with an impartial and evidence-based approach. We felt satisfied that the new editor had the right experience and vision for this role. Well, on retraction watch, the comment was made, yes, that is true. The publisher is concerned that the perspective of industrial polluters has previously been neglected. Taylor and Francis also noted that they retracted the article of the previous editor because it was inadvertently published before the review process was completed, and it was subsequently decided to be unsuitable for publication, and 3 further articles were flagged up. So here's a paper that's published in the journal. It's on PubMed, it's indexed, but the publishers actually basically withdraw the paper. And the paper they withdrew was a very severe critique of Bakelite, a study related to a corporate hazard by a consulting company called Exponent. And you can see at the bottom, this content has been removed by the publishers. So it wasn't formally a retraction, which you reserve for, unethical or unsound science or misrepresentation. It was simply they removed it. So how could they do this? Well, the COPE guideline says that new editors should honor previous publication decisions unless serious problems. Well, the publisher were basically going to pull papers and the new editor wasn't doing anything about it. The editors should decide without interference from the publisher. And clearly the publisher was making all the shots, and the editor actually said, when we asked him, he claimed no part in any of these decisions. The relationship of the editor to the publisher should be independent. Well, quite clearly the editor here is unable to. The old editor is fired and his paper is being withdrawn and the new editor is not doing anything. Retraction should only be done if serious and only as a last resort. And there was no evidence that anything was wrong with this paper, and there was no discussion with the author at all. Editors should champion freedom of expression, and here the publishers implied that there was some legal issue, libel issues at stake. Editors should preclude business needs from compromising intellectual standards. Well, quite clearly the editor was unable to do that. And keep editorial board members updated on new policies. Basically, the publisher did what it's like without talking to the editorial board. So I was part of the editorial board that resigned. We lodged a complaint. The complaint was not dealt with. COPE basically failed to do anything. And in fact, the journal has not published since 2018. So essentially, the publishers decided to kill the journal rather than face up to threats of being sued by a corporation for criticism that was scientifically sound, peer-reviewed. Asbestos, only one example of many. We know that there are corporate consultants paid by the asbestos industry who publish and don't declare their conflict of interest. This is the European Journal of Cancer Prevention, La Vecchia and Boffetta. They did not state that they had been funded by the Italian Cancer Research Association and that they had a conflict of interest. They said they had no conflict of interest. Both statements were untrue, and a complaint was lodged to COPE. The editors denied conflict of interest, as did the authors, and COPE eventually upheld the complaint, recommended correction, but they acknowledged they can't really enforce it, even though they recommended it. But in this case, the journal did publish the correction. And there are many cases where this doesn't happen. So we did a quick analysis of occupational journals which publish on pesticides and occupational hazards. We ended up with 34 journals at the end of the day, and we looked at questions of how they declare their management of conflict of interest, COPE membership, whether they declare editorial independence, the process and enforcement. And we found basically most journals are members of COPE. They like to declare it. They provide for conflict of interest. So you submit a paper, you have to talk about it. Usually financial, sometimes non-financial. Not one of the journals actually made explicit any editorial independence, and very few had any enforcement measures. And they really rely on the COPE guideline for enforcement, which we realize is actually powerless because in the IJEOH case, they did nothing. So what is there to be done? What can we do? I'm going to talk about three things. guidelines from the INEP, the International Network on Epidemiology and Public Health Practice, civil society advocacy, and university policies. So the International Network for Epidemiology and Policy is a network of public health organizations which has pushed quite hard for ethics and integrity in science. It's developed a conflict of interest position statement at this URL, which basically helps you to identify conflict of interest, how you can avoid it, gives guidelines for disclosure, and it gives guidelines for managing it as recusal, etc. It provides a toolkit for epidemiology that can be used to train epidemiologists to look at the epidemiology and how it's been distorted, to review the literature for junk science or uninformed studies such as underpowered studies, and identify who is misusing epidemiology. And basically, the COPE guidelines are not enough to stop manipulation of the literature. We need more. There's also civil society advocacy. So the Southern African Alcohol Policy Alliance, of which I'm an advisor, plays a constant watchdog role over government to keep alcohol industry at arm's length. And the alcohol industry are very predatory, very voracious, and it's a lot of work to keep them out of policy processes. It also is raising questions for other civil society groups about accepting industry funding. And as you know, many civil society organizations are desperate for financial support. And so there's a lot of pressure. And there's an opportunity for the industry to get front organizations up acting for them. So it's a lot of educational work with other civil society groups. But what it has been pushing for is that the sugar tax and other kinds of taxes be directed specifically to a health promotion development foundation whose mandate would be to promote health. But within that, there would be unlinked, sort of unconditional funding for research that would basically be able to address these problems of alcohol and sugar and other harms, but not have an industry influence about what kinds of research is done. Also want to comment on Right on Canada. Some of you will know Kathleen Ruff, who's a long-time human rights activist, who's absolutely relentless about monitoring journals and universities over asbestos collaborations and calling them out and putting pressure on them. And also in partnering with other civil society networks, holding public health organizations accountable. There's currently a big campaign to put pressure on the American Public Health Association over its collaboration with tobacco, particularly the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. And then the People's Health Movement, of which I'm a part, has an activity called the WHO Watch, which basically goes to Geneva and actually monitors the World Health Assemblies. It's very strong on calling out private sector influence, informing governments about the role private sector is playing in lobbying at the WHO and pushing hard for that. It's also very much focused on the right to health. So there are many other civil society examples, but I've just given some to give a sense that we have to take charge of our own destiny through holding government accountable and keeping industry out of position. I'll close with just one last example. So at my university, 2018, a graduate school of business professor planned to host a Philip Morris talk about vaping, electronic nicotine device systems. It was in a department of marketing, and it was presented as like a very positive example of market disruption. I don't know the term they use. But there was a big public outcry, and eventually the event was cancelled because it seemed like somebody was taking a chance. But the university didn't have a policy on taking tobacco industry or hosting tobacco organizations. And the following year, a UCT professor in my faculty accepted funding from the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World for a center on tobacco and mental health, actually. Again, a big public outcry, and the health science faculty basically hit back hard, adopted a policy basically precluding any tobacco funding, and then got the university to adopt a university-wide policy. So officially, the University of Cape Town will not accept any sponsorship from tobacco companies or front organizations as defined by WHO. And this was joint academic student advocacy that closed that door. So I think there are possibilities to do positive things to control conflict of interest. So just to conclude, corporate interests continue to threaten the integrity of scientific research and publication. If we don't keep that at bay, if we don't keep it out of journal publication, it's a threat to the unbiased dissemination of evidence, and that threatens our human rights. It threatens our right to health. It threatens our right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. We do have tools we can use to combat the problem, and we must use these opportunities to ensure the integrity of our science. Thank you. I'll take questions.
Thank you, Dr. London. Vamos de inmediato a pasar a preguntas y comentarios del público, y la dinámica que vamos a seguir, haremos las preguntas en español inicialmente, y luego en inglés. Bernard las estará compartiendo y para que el doctor haga su réplica. Tenemos una primera que nos dice qué piensa respecto a la omisión o la resistencia de los centros de investigación por abordar viejos y persistentes problemas, tales como el alcoholismo, la violencia, el tabaquismo, que se complejizan con la exposición de trabajadores a espacios altamente inseguros y bajo mucha presión.
So Leslie, this is your first question. Thanks a lot for your presentation. So the question is, why do you think researchers omit or do hardly address old and persisting problems such as alcoholism, violence, that are complex due to exposures to other factors, such as workers' exposures to certain risks at the workplace, including psychosocial factors?
So the question is, why do I think researchers ignore those problems?
Yes, why they are like understudied? You know, why they're hardly on the agenda anymore?
Well, so the example of alcohol is interesting because if you're trying to study alcohol and harm reduction for alcohol, the industry will be very quick to fund research into things which don't really work. So industry will fund research into education, public awareness. I'm not saying you shouldn't do education or public awareness, but the effectiveness of that is actually very limited. Things which work are, you know, controlling taxation or controlling advertising, and industry will not fund that and try and lobby against it. You know, we all in a world where funding for research is very limited. So it's quite hard for a new researcher, a young researcher who wants to develop a career. Corporate comes along and offers funding in a particular area, whereas actually problems of alcohol or the mental health, which are the big problems, there's no funding for that. So you go where the funding is. It's quite hard. So I think we have to support our researchers to, you know, amongst ourselves, so that we can do that kind of research on the big problems. And that, I think, is why the Health Promotion Foundation idea in South Africa is so important, because nobody's going to fund research that is bad for profits. And the only way you're going to fund that research is from taxes. And government has many calls on its budgets. We're all in austerity. But if you have a Health Promotion Foundation, that's ring-fenced money, which could be used for funding that kind of research, which nobody else is going to fund. And then, you know, researchers could apply to that for funding, and it's independent. The decision as to give funding is independent of industry. I don't know if I've answered the question, but maybe there isn't really an answer.
Thank you, Leslie. Tenemos otra pregunta que nos dice, bueno, en el contexto actual al que están sometidas especialmente las universidades públicas, y bueno, tomando en cuenta las palabras introductorias del vicerrector y la evidencia que usted claramente ha expuesto, estamos ante una situación de reducción significativa del presupuesto, con una presión decisiva por parte de las industrias, las corporaciones, y que tienen alta incidencia respecto a la conducción de la investigación. ¿Cuál considera que debería ser el rol de investigadoras, investigadores ante este contexto?
So the question is, we are currently in the academic sector under lots of pressure and we are facing lots of budget cuts. And so what do you think our role should be as academic within this current context? How can we like combat the conflicts of interest while we are under lots of pressure and there's like we are easily maybe accused of having a conflict of interest ourselves?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And there isn't an easy answer for that. I'm going to post in the chat a URL. We are part of a network it's a global network on governance, equity, and conflict of interest in public health. It started at the American University of Beirut, and we were involved with a study where we looked at how schools of public health were or weren't accepting money from industry for research in non-communicable disease. And we realized that it's a really hard decision for many people because, you know, if the tobacco industry comes to you, it's clear. But maybe it's an industry that has a harmful product, but it's funding you for something else. Or maybe it's funding you in a way that it's not actually clear that there is a conflict of interest. So I think we have to work in networks, and I will try and post the URL for the actual network, and you can visit and see and maybe join if you're interested, and support each other. And I think we have to be able to raise awareness about this, like this seminar, but also training courses, training programs. We are in South Africa working with colleagues in Cameroon, Kenya, to develop a toolkit for ethics committees. So if the ethics committees get proposals, they have to know how to work, how to deal with conflict of interest. For science councils, if they're granting money in Africa, they should understand how the granting of money doesn't reinforce conflict of interest. So I think it's on us as academics. We just have to empower ourselves and have to empower others. There's no simple answer at the end of the day because it is a choice, and industry will do what it has to do to make money. You know that we can't pretend otherwise. But we should have ways of working that keep that at bay. So if industry wants to lobby for particular policies, that's their business, but they shouldn't be inside the policy room, and they shouldn't influence research in a way that gives false information into a policy process.
Otra pregunta que nos hacen a través del panel directo en Zoom señala si conoce de algún movimiento o esfuerzos esfuerzos colectivos por intentar retirar los artículos, las investigaciones con sesgos en las bases de datos bibliográficas.
The next question is, Leslie, if you know about movements or collective efforts where people try to identify like misleading papers and like maybe put like a note on them or like mark them that people should be careful with those papers. Do you know about those? Do you know about the existence of those groups?
So it's like, you know, that there is a website that used to be a website anyway of predatory publishers. So you could go to the website and you could see which publishers were publishing, you know, just for money. It was published by a librarian in the US called Beale, but I think he stopped that, partly because I think he got a lot of conflict criticism. But in fact, the former editor of the Journal of Environmental and Occupational Health has started a new journal of scientific and publication integrity. So you will find in that journal a lot of information about these kind of conflicts. It's not naming articles as being invalid. But it gives a case study, for example, of how publishers have interfered with various publication processes, the integrity of that. To get an article labeled as bad or retracted is quite an extreme thing, and there has to be a due process. I'm not aware that there's actually a way of identifying bad science other than you reading it and realizing. I think if you are able to, and that's why declaring a conflict of interest is so important. It doesn't mean that the science is bad, but it means you would pay more attention. So I'm not sure there's a simple answer to that. I am going to post the URL for the global, the network on governance, equity, and conflict of interest in public health. I've just posted it.
Okay. Muchas gracias. En la misma línea, si conoce alguna experiencia en algún país que exista alguna política para que los fondos que ingresan de afuera, que exista alguna agencia gubernamental que pueda, que a través de una agencia gubernamental se puedan financiar la investigación y que esto permita controlar posibles sesgos en los resultados de investigación.
And so the next question is, if you know, Leslie, about maybe experience in a country that maybe canalize their funds through a governmental agency, so to stay away of the conflicts of interest and to reduce the influence that funders may have for the research. So, for example, that the funds enter, but then they enter to like a governmental agency, and then then researchers can apply for it.
So, I mean, the question of research funding through government agencies, like the NIH. So we have a South African Medical Research Council that's obviously not as wealthy as the NIH, and it does donate, it does give grants, and it is independent of industry. I'm not aware of any journals unless they are linked to a research council. So, for instance, the NIEHS has the Environmental Health Perspectives, which is an independent journal, high impact factor, high integrity, and that's funded by public money, although you pay to subscribe. So that's through a government entity. I'm not aware of other examples in low middle income countries though. So it's usually linked to either a professional organization, which would set up its own journal, or a research council or research body. But even then we know that they can be influenced by industry. So.
Okay. Hay bueno, también vinculado ya a continuar con estas que están relacionadas también con manejo de información y presupuestos. ¿Qué piensa, doctor Leslie, en relación si las autoridades sanitarias cuentan con las herramientas necesarias para poder filtrar estas investigaciones que tienen un claro contenido de sesgo e interés?
Within the line of this like same kind of question, Dr. Leslie London, do you think if public health authorities are like have sufficient capacity to identify research that has a conflict of interest?
So I think it's very difficult and it varies a lot. So I think that's part of the problem, that in most low middle income countries, if you have a good scientist working for government, their conditions of service is probably much worse than if they were working for industry. So for instance, we know in our Department of Agriculture, the Office for Registration of Pesticides has people who don't have very high levels of skills, because if they had a PhD and were skilled, they could get much more money working for industry, and that's what happens. And we see that throughout Africa. So the skills which you need to interpret a research are often not there for that reason, and because we know neoliberal policy means that governments can't spend money on public servants because that's bad. It's a big public wage bill, you have to cut your wage bill. So you don't get good quality or skilled people in those positions, or if you do, they don't stay. There is also the question of, it's not always that easy, and that's why building capacity to address that is really important. And there's also obviously the political influence. So many politicians are themselves linked to harmful industries in different ways. Our president, for all the benefits he has brought to changing South Africa for the better, was formerly executive of South African breweries and alcohol industry. So those sort of connections mean that the officials who work in those departments will have a lot of pressure put on them, indirectly and directly. And also, if you try and raise questions of conflict of interest, it's not always the case the officials will understand what you mean. But that's why it's so important to work with government and try and educate them so that there's greater awareness, because I think in general, there's not very strong ability to identify these kinds of conflicted information. So I think there are two examples. The one I gave you about the Gauteng Health Department purchasing hydrogen peroxide aerosolized disinfectant. I mean, that was so obvious that it was rubbish. And the official who was dealing with it didn't see it. On the other hand, when it comes to tobacco, South Africa is a signatory to the Framework Convention. And that is very clear. And in fact, it helps the officials keep industry out. So I think there's an important lesson in that, is that we had more legislative or institutional protection by law. It would protect officials, because they feel nervous about going against industry if there isn't a law that enables them to do that.
Thank you. Tenemos dos que están relacionadas, voy a hacer en conjunto. ¿Qué opinión le merece la posibilidad de que existan revistas públicas respaldadas por el Estado como posibilidad o estrategia para evitar la incidencia de intereses corporativos? Y en tal caso, o sea, si existieran revistas públicas que digamos que estén planteadas éticamente desde este posicionamiento, ¿cuáles son las posibilidades o las consideraciones que se tendrían que tener para lograr evitar la incidencia o el lobby político de las corporaciones?
Sí, la última parte, perdón.
Perdón, sí, es que estamos en estos momentos, preguntas por Facebook, en privado, y esta no nos pusimos de acuerdo. La última parte es que en caso de existir revistas que claramente tengan la intención de evitar la incidencia de las corporaciones, ¿verdad? Como cuáles serían los criterios fundamentales.
Okay, Leslie. So the question is a bit coming back to the journals. What do you think about scientific journals backed up by governments? You mentioned like the example of EHP, and that seemed to be like the only one. But what criteria should take into account these journals so to be more aware of the conflicts of interest and to publish like sound science?
So I think that's a really important question. So I mean, obviously, if it's possible to have a journal that is independent, that is the goal. Obviously, a journal could be not independent if it's funded by government, depending on what the government is. So, for instance, we know in East Africa, there's very strong hostility to homosexuality, for example. And I can't imagine a journal funded by a government in East Africa actually permitting research which legitimizes in any way something which has political issues for government. So we would have to also be careful about government. It's not always the case that it's independent. So but the question is really whether it's independent. What can journals do about conflict of interest? Well, there must be the declaration, but the declaration alone is not enough. So I think there have to be systems in place to scrutinize the science in better ways that make sure that it's not being slipped through under the radar. But also it's where the funding goes and who's supporting that funding. So you know, if a journal receives a certain set of publication for a special issue, for example, you know, it could actually be more active about seeking out independent research, and it certainly might well take a position, for instance, that certain kinds of funding should not be published. So tobacco, I mean, many journals will not publish any publications by people who've taken money from the tobacco industry because of the Framework Convention. I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but at least declaration and heightened criticism, you know, heightened critique of the science is really important, and not allowing sort of journal publication to be used for propaganda, for presenting a particular position.
Ok. Ahora vamos a recuperar una de las preguntas que realizaron desde el Face y dice lo siguiente. En el contexto de la actual emergencia por la COVID-19 se ha dado una gran participación por parte de la industria farmacéutica. Esta participación ocurre en un contexto de clara incertidumbre respecto al virus y las formas de afrontarlo. Y la pregunta dice, ¿existen factores o criterios que orientan a la comunidad científica y a la sociedad civil para poder reconocer conflictos de interés en contextos de incertidumbre como el actual? Y hace referencia pues, a la forma en que se han aprobado las primeras vacunas contra el coronavirus.
So this question is about another issue, and it is, well, it says, within the context of emergency of COVID-19, there has been a big participation of the pharmaceutical industry. This participation has been in a context of huge uncertainty about the virus and the ways to combat it. So my question is, do you know about factors or criteria that may exist to guide the scientific community and civil society to recognize possible conflicts of interest within this context of great uncertainty? Like, for example, the first vaccines were like approved very quickly. And this, yeah, so this is like a worry of this person.
So no, it's a good question. So it's not just scientific uncertainty, it's also about the rapidity of the response, because what we've seen with vaccine development has been extraordinarily quick, and I think appropriately quick, but it has come with this potential for conflict of interest to sneak in. So in our country, we had this exact problem. So the first vaccines we had were AstraZeneca vaccines from the Serum Institute of India. They were purchased. We were already planning to give them to our health workers for phase 1, part of the WHO SAGE framework. And then the results came out saying, well, actually the AstraZeneca vaccine was not very effective for the variant that we have in South Africa. And then, within a week or two, suddenly the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was not approved, but it was adopted. But there wasn't any transparency about why it was adopted. And both vaccines have been trialed in South Africa. So there are researchers involved in both vaccines. So the only way around that is transparency. The only way is to be sure there's no conflict of interest there, because the PI on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a ministerial advisor, and now we have the Johnson & Johnson vaccine vaccinating our health workers. The only way to be sure that there isn't a conflict of interest operating there is if there's transparency, openness. What's the data? What's the evidence? Why are we doing this? And the South African government hasn't been very good at that. So for sure, it is a risk because there's such a need and it has to be done so quickly. It's quite possible for conflict of interest to be hidden. And we've seen it manifest in, corruption of procurement of PPE, for example. But there's a potential in the scientific field for conflict of interest to slip certain kinds of results in and other kinds of results out. And we should guard against that. And the only way to do that is by being transparent.
Okay. Tenemos un comentario y una consulta que realiza Luz Claudio y dice Leli, la cual compartimos el comentario: esta presentación debería ser requerida, obligatoria en todas las universidades y centros de investigación biomédica. A pesar de que las políticas de divulgación desde el COIPERS aún persisten los problemas que usted claramente ha detallado a lo largo de la exposición. Y pregunta lo siguiente: una vez que los borradores, los artículos son sometidos e ingresan a la corriente principal y a la prensa, aún sin revisión por pares, especialmente durante el contexto de la pandemia por el COVID, es muy difícil retractarse de los mismos o entrar a corregir, a evidenciar los resultados. ¿Qué se está haciendo para llegar a la prensa, a los medios de comunicación masivos, a la gente, para evitar, para que se evite que se publiquen informes que aún no han sido revisados por pares?
So this is a comment and a question by Luz Claudio, and as well, she's really impressed with your presentation, and she thinks it should be like obligatory material for all academics at the universities and the ethic committees. So it's very good and very informative. And then the question is about the situation with COVID. Some results, they came out before peer review and then were like already all over the world in the newspapers, so communicated at a massive level. So what do you think should be done to avoid that these communications are made before the papers have been peer reviewed, so that like already the public is being informed before the actual papers have been gone through to the whole process of peer review, and they didn't get to the publication yet. So what is your opinion about it?
So it's a good question. I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that, because I think it is important that the information is made available as quickly as possible, as openly as possible, but it needs to be made available in a way that makes it clear it is provisional. So I know, for instance, with COVID, for example, the question of the tobacco, the smoking issue, there was a preprint paper which is famous now. A hospital in Paris showed that people who were smokers were less likely to be admitted to hospital. And the argument was made that something in smoking, nicotine, protected you against COVID. And that got massive information very quickly and became sort of a trope. But the point is that paper was never published. So I think that the whole preprint industry has to be restructured in a way that if you have a preprint, it actually should be withdrawn if it's not actually peer-reviewed and published. It's not possible easily to say, well, within 3 months, 6 months, whatever the case may be. But I think there needs to be some comeback so that that information doesn't stay there. On the other hand, you know, there will be cases where people will put out information that's just wrong. So long, I just think that if it's put out there with the proviso that it's provisional information and it's not confirmed or peer reviewed. Of course, in practice, the social media will take anything and make it fact almost immediately. So it's very hard to ensure that. But from the scientific community point of view, we should have some rules about what becomes sort of what moves from exploratory, hypothetical to what becomes evidence. And there has to be a clear process of getting there, I think. But it's a good question because there is no easy answer.
Okay. Bueno, tenemos la última pregunta y comentario, que es de Clemens propiamente. Y bueno, creo que nos sumamos por parte del IRED, de la universidad, a reiterar nuestro agradecimiento y tal como señala Clemens, con los ejemplos tan claros e interesantes que ha planteado en esta mañana, bueno, la noche por Sudáfrica. Y Clemens realiza la siguiente pregunta y si gusta, como Clemens nos acompaña en esta sala, yo le invitaría ahora a hacer la pregunta en inglés, de paso saludar a Leslie, puesto que este intento de que Leslie nos acompañara lo iniciamos en el 2019 y lamentablemente no se nos hizo el año pasado. Este pareciera difícil, pero sin duda alguna vamos a continuar y persistir en que nos visite apenas sea posible por acá. Y Clemens pregunta, Leslie, si tendrías sugerencias respecto a cómo enfocar la investigación de políticas relacionadas con la reducción del uso excesivo de antibióticos en salud humana, medicina veterinaria, en acuicultura, dado su impacto relacionado con patógenos multiresistentes. Si gusta, Clemens.
Gracias, Rocío. Está bien, excelente. Thank you, Leslie. Without more words, we were really enjoying your talk. It's so important, and it's so nice that you are another part of the world, and we know we have all the same problems all over the world related to the influence of the companies. You mentioned several companies. I know colleagues of them. I've met them in several meetings related to the pesticides, pesticide use, etc. And it's so important. My question was a little bit more related to the antibiotics, because you not mentioned antibiotics, and I think we have, of course, the same stuff as with pesticides and with the other examples you gave. But maybe you can give some tips, because antibiotics really are also related directly to human health, and I feel it's always difficult to talk about it, because obviously we need the antibiotics, but it's so. Maybe you have some suggestions how you handle it, for example, in South Africa, or some nice tips. Thanks.
So it's a very interesting question. Thanks, Clement. So I've gotten involved in work on COVID surveillance of wastewater for RNA fragments. In other words, using it as a surveillance tool for mapping sort of an upsurge in COVID before the wave comes. And this was actually because researchers were involved in monitoring wastewater for medications, for pharmaceuticals. Not so much antibiotics, but they were looking at opiates. But it struck me that because they were doing that work, we were able to extend it to COVID. And now everybody's talking about wastewater monitoring, because we're waiting for our third wave, and we want to know before the third wave comes. So people are interested. So this is the ideal political opportunity to say, well, we have the technology to monitor. You know, we're doing all this monitoring. Let's extend it afterwards. You know, COVID hopefully is not going to be with us forever, but we have the capacity now to monitor sewage, for example. You know, and once you demonstrate the levels of antibiotics in wastewater, people will go up. You know, they'll say, hang on, this is a real problem. So maybe that's an opportunity. I don't know. And the other thing is, you know, the civil societies in South Africa is organizing around pesticides. They have a network called Unpoison. And, you know, into that network, we can insert questions of climate change. We can put questions of GM. We can put questions of antibiotics in food systems because it's all related. So, you know, there are civil society groups doing GM and there's civil society groups doing pesticides, and bring them together. And maybe that's a stronger lobby. So those are the two suggestions I would have. There's no simple answer to that, yeah.
Gracias. Definitivamente necesitaríamos más tiempo con Lely y mejor si es presencial. Pero bueno, creo que las preguntas, comentarios han permitido ampliar y no solo dar algunos criterios o tips, como señalaba Clemens, respecto a los desafíos que actualmente tenemos, sino que nos generan preguntas y tareas realmente necesarias en el contexto en que vivimos. Y sin duda alguna es un acierto el planteamiento que con mucha seriedad vienen haciendo las vicerrectorías de investigación, de extensión y el instituto en relación con plantear y reflexionar sobre conflicto de interés y los problemas éticos que se presentan en el marco de las investigaciones, pero particularmente investigación biomédica e investigación que involucra temas en biodiversidad y ambiente. Si gusta, creo que Berna nos comparte unas palabras con Leslie.
Okay, so Leslie, Rosia told us that, well, we definitely need to continue. It's like the conclusion of the seminar, that it was really interesting. And we definitely need to continue our conversation in the future. So hopefully, yeah, we can meet after the pandemic has vanished a bit. And yeah, as you said, at an internal level at our university, well, we can already start working, talking about more about conflicts of interest, for example, with the Vice-Rector of Research and Extension Outreach. And yeah, we really loved having you here. We are really grateful, and you really helped us with your clear examples. And so we hope to be in touch. And Rocio will now close in Spanish.
Okay.
Bye bye.
También agradecer a la comunidad universitaria y al público que nos acompaña afortunadamente hoy de distintos países y lugares. Recordarles que la grabación de esta charla va a estar disponible en breve a través del Face del IRED, de la Vicerrectoría de Extensión y la Vicerrectoría de Investigación. Sin duda, tal como lo señaló Luz Claudio, el aporte, la disertación que ha realizado Leslie el día de hoy es de gran insumo y casi que obligatoriedad para las personas que trabajamos en estas áreas. Siempre les invitamos a acompañarnos en los espacios que con entusiasmo y mucha responsabilidad venimos generando desde el instituto y los posgrados. Thanks, Dr. London, for your dissertation. The moment force has to review the ethics of the universities in the face of research and the generation of knowledge, especially when resources are reduced and the possibilities of help by the private capital conditions their participation of economic support and on their interest affected the scientific integrity and its real contributions to public health especially. Thank you very much y muy buen día a todos y buenas noches en Sudáfrica.